The year is 1976. The location is a desolate, rain-swept observation post on the edges of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, just miles from the inner border that slices Europe in half. For the men stationed here, the world is defined by steel and mud. The Soviet Union has spent the last 3 decades perfecting a singular, terrifying art form, the armored blitzkrieg. Their strategy is mathematical and brutal. In the event of a war with NATO, the plan is to flood the Fulda Gap with so many T-62 and T-72 tanks that the Western defenses will simply drown in the metal tide. They rely on speed. They rely on overwhelming numbers. But most of all, they rely on the assumption that the air above them belongs to the fast movers, the supersonic jets that fight high in the stratosphere. Colonel Valery Petrov, a hardened veteran of armored tactics, stands peering through high-powered binoculars across the training grounds of a Warsaw Pact exercise. He is watching the pinnacle of Soviet military engineering. Below him, a column of heavy armor churns the earth, their diesel engines roaring in a symphony of power. These machines are designed to withstand chemical weapons, nuclear fallout, and the kinetic energy of Western shells. They are the sledgehammer of the Politburo. But on this grey morning, something impossible happens. It begins not with a visual, but with a sound. It is not the high-pitched scream of a jet engine, which sounds like tearing canvas. It is something deeper, a low, guttural moan like wind blowing over the mouth of a massive glass bottle, vibrating in the chest before it is even heard by the ears. The sound is confusing to the tank crews. It is too slow. It is too rhythmic. Petrov adjusts his focus. The reports from the forward scouts are panicked and contradictory. They are claiming that something is loitering. In the strict doctrine of air combat, aircraft do not loiter. They strike and vanish. To linger is suicide. To fly low and slow is to invite destruction from the thousands of anti-aircraft guns, the ZSU-234 Shilkars, that accompany every Soviet armored regiment. Then the shadow breaks the cloud cover. It is hideous. That is the first thought that strikes the colonel. It lacks the sleek, predatory elegance of a MiG-21 or the brutish speed of a MiG-25. It looks agricultural. It has straight wings that jut out awkwardly, and 2 massive engines that sit high on the back of the fuselage, exposed and vulnerable. It looks like a mistake. It looks like a transport plane that has lost its way. The Soviet anti-air operators engage immediately. This is a reflex. A slow target at 300 feet is a gift. The sky lights up with tracers. In any simulation, in any previous war, this clumsy aircraft would be turned into a fireball within seconds. The physics of modern warfare dictate it. You cannot survive a net of 23mm explosive rounds while flying at subsonic speeds. But the fireball does not come. Through his optics, Petrov watches a stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds impact the fuselage of the strange craft. He sees the sparks. He sees the shudder of the airframe. He waits for the wing to shear off. He waits for the engine to disintegrate. Instead, the aircraft dips its nose. What follows is a sound that will haunt the nightmares of Soviet tankers for the next 15 years. It is not the sound of a machine gun. It is the sound of the atmosphere itself being ripped apart. A deep, resonant brrrr that lasts for 2 seconds. On the ground, 3 tanks simply cease to exist. They do not just explode, they are dismantled. The turrets, weighing tons, are tossed into the air like toys. The armor plating, designed to stop high-velocity shells, is perforated like Swiss cheese. The aircraft banks, revealing its underside. It is riddled with holes from the anti-aircraft fire. Smoke is trailing from one of the engines. By all laws of aerodynamics and structural integrity known to Soviet engineering, this machine should be falling out of the sky. Its hydraulics should be severed. Its pilot should be dead. But the pilot is not dead. The machine levels out. The smoke turns from black to white as a fire suppression system engages something the Soviets have rarely seen work so effectively. The aircraft does not retreat. It turns. It is coming back for a second pass. Panic begins to set in over the radio network. This is not just an attack, it is a violation of natural law. The Soviet military worldview is built on the concept of the glass cannon weapons that are deadly but fragile. They understand that if you hit a plane, it dies. If you hit a tank, it stops. But this thing is absorbing punishment that would destroy a heavy bomber. A shoulder-fired missile, a Strela, streaks up from the infantry lines. It is a direct hit on the tail section. An explosion blossoms. Petrov flinches, expecting the debris field. The smoke clears. Half of the tail is gone. The elevator control surface is shredded. And yet, the aircraft continues its turn. It is still flying. It is still hunting. If you want to uncover the hidden history of the Cold War and the machines that defined it, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We break down the classified files others overlook. The stakes in this moment, on this muddy training field, suddenly shift from a tactical annoyance to a strategic crisis. Colonel Petrov lowers his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. He is not afraid of the weapon itself, but of what it represents. If the Americans have built a plane that cannot be shot down by standard air defenses, the entire Soviet strategy for the invasion of Europe is worthless. The Red Army's doctrine relies on the tank rush. They plan to accept heavy losses, calculating that they have more tanks than NATO has missiles. But that calculus relies on the ability to kill the attackers. If a single American aircraft can destroy 10, 20 or 30 tanks, absorb direct missile hits and then fly home to be repaired and return the next day, the math no longer works. The Soviet Union has spent billions of rubles building a force designed to fight other tanks. They have built a force designed to fight fast jets. They have completely neglected the possibility of a slow, invincible predator. Petrov watches as the crippled machine finally turns west, limping back toward the NATO lines, trailing smoke but stubbornly remaining airborne. It has survived a direct missile hit. It has survived hundreds of rounds of cannon fire. It has destroyed a platoon of armor in seconds. The radio chatter is a cacophony of confusion. "Target hit but operative," one operator screams. "It has no right to fly," another yells. This incident, while possibly a simulation or a border friction event, crystallizes a new reality. The reports that travel up the chain of command to Moscow are not met with skepticism, but with a cold, creeping dread. They describe a devil that refuses to die. They describe a weapon that targets the top armor of tanks, the weakest point, with a gun that possesses the power of a naval destroyer. But the most terrifying detail in the report is not the gun, it is the survival. In the Kremlin, the generals look at the photos taken by long-range cameras. They see the damage. They consult their own aeronautical engineers. The engineers shake their heads. "This is impossible," they say. "A plane with that much structural damage loses lift. It enters a flat spin. The pilot ejects." "It did not eject," the intelligence officer replies. "It flew home." The mystery deepens. What is this machine made of? Is it a new composite material? Is it some form of force field technology? The Soviet mind, prone to paranoia, begins to spin wild theories. They cannot conceive that the answer might be something archaic, something surprisingly simple. They assume it must be high-tech sorcery. The psychological impact on the ground troops is immediate. Rumors spread through the barracks of the group of Soviet forces in Germany. They talk of the silent death, though it is far from silent. They talk of the plane that eats missiles. Tank crews, usually the most confident men in the Soviet army, begin to look at the sky with suspicion. They start welding extra scrap metal to the roofs of their T-72 tanks, a futile gesture against what is coming. The colonel writes his final assessment in the logbook that night. The ink stains the paper as he presses down hard. "We are prepared for a war of speed," he writes. "We are prepared for a war of nuclear exchange. We are not prepared for a war against a ghost that treats our anti-aircraft fire like rain." The incident at the border is over, but the fear has just begun. The Soviet military machine, a juggernaut of steel and discipline, has found a crack in its armor. And they have no idea that this is just the beginning of the nightmare. They have no idea that the Americans haven't just built a new plane. They have resurrected a philosophy of war that the jet age was supposed to have buried. The hunt for answers begins now. The KGB, the GRU, and the entire intelligence apparatus of the Eastern Bloc are about to be mobilized to answer one simple question. What is that thing, and how do we kill it? The intelligence packet that lands on the desk of General Ivan Shkadov in Moscow is stamped with the highest classification level available to the GRU. It is not a thick file. It contains only grainy black and white photographs taken from the gun cameras of chasing MiG-21 fighters and a series of frantic audio transcripts from ground radar operators. The year is 1977. The atmosphere inside the Soviet Ministry of Defense is toxic with suspicion. The report details the encounter near the border, but it also aggregates similar anomalies from monitoring stations across Eastern Europe. Shkadov, a man who has built his career on the certainty of Soviet superior numbers, stares at the photographs. The object in the pictures defies the aesthetic of the jet age. Every aircraft produced by the Soviet Union or the United States in the last 20 years has been swept-winged, needle-nosed, and designed for Mach 2. They are darts meant to pierce the sky. The machine in the photo looks like a mistake. It looks like an insect. The investigation begins not with a tactical assessment, but with an engineering inquest. The GRU summons the top aeronautical designers from the Sukhoi and Mikoyan design bureaus. They are brought into a windowless room and shown the footage of the aircraft surviving the direct missile hit. "Explain this," the general demands. The engineers are baffled. The footage clearly shows a Strela missile, a heat seeker, impacting the starboard engine of the American aircraft. In every simulation, the result is constant. The engine explodes, shrapnel severs the hydraulic lines running through the tail, the control surfaces go limp, and the aircraft enters an unrecoverable dive. "It is a kinetic impossibility," one Sukhoi engineer argues, gesturing at the blurry image of the smoking plane flying level. The blast radius of the warhead is large enough to strip the tail stabilizer. Even if the structure holds, the hydraulic pressure loss is instantaneous. The pilot should have lost control within 2 seconds, but the pilot did not lose control. The investigation fractures into 3 distinct branches, each driven by a growing sense of paranoia. The first branch focuses on the invisible shield. A theory gains traction within the Kremlin that the Americans have developed a new form of electronic jamming that detonates the missile before impact, minimizing the damage. They believe the explosion seen in the footage is a trick of the light, or a proximity detonation that failed to penetrate the skin. They cannot accept that the skin itself is the shield. They waste millions of rubles upgrading the sensitivity of their missile fuses, chasing a ghost solution to a problem that is purely structural. The second branch of the investigation focuses on the ghost pilot. The KGB begins to analyze the flight patterns. The aircraft moves sluggishly, yet with terrifying precision. It hugs the terrain, flying below the tree line in valleys, popping up only to fire that devastating cannon. No human pilot would fly a jet into the teeth of a ZSU-23-4 voluntarily, an intelligence analyst notes. The risk calculation is illogical. This leads to the terrifying, albeit wrong, conclusion that the aircraft might be a drone, an automated killing machine with no survival instinct. This idea chills the Soviet leadership. If the Americans are sending robots to fight, they can afford to lose thousands of them. The Soviet doctrine relies on inflicting casualties to break the American public's will to fight. You cannot break the will of a circuit board. The third, and most frantic branch of the investigation, takes place on the ground, at the proving grounds in the Ural Mountains. Here, the Soviet army tries to replicate the damage they are seeing. They take decommissioned MiG-17 and Su-7 fuselages older, tougher planes, and fire their own weapons at them. They fire 23mm rounds. The planes tear apart. They fire shoulder-launched missiles. The planes disintegrate. The lead ballistic expert reports back to the ministry. "Comrades, for an aircraft to survive the damage reported in the German sector, it would need to be built like a tank, not an airplane. But a flying tank is an aerodynamic absurdity. The weight of the armor would prevent it from carrying ordnance. It would be a brick." They are missing the point because they are obsessed with the high-tech narrative. They assume the Americans have solved gravity, when in fact, the Americans have simply ignored convention. The mystery deepens as reports come in regarding the weapon system carried by this bogeyman. Recovered debris from the target tanks on the border reveals holes that are clean, punched through the heavy turret armor. Spectroscopic analysis of the residue around the holes sets off radiation alarms in the labs. "It is radioactive," the scientist whispers to his handler. Panic surges. Are the Americans firing tactical nuclear shells from a rotary cannon? The concept is insane. The fallout would kill the pilot. But the readings are undeniable. The metal used in the projectile is denser than lead, harder than steel, and mildly radioactive. They label the material Alloy X. They do not yet understand the concept of depleted uranium as a mass-produced ammunition. To the Soviet investigators, this implies a level of material science that is decades ahead of their own capabilities. They begin to imagine a weapon that poisons the battlefield while destroying it. As 1978 rolls into 1979, the mystery plane gets a name in the classified Soviet briefings. They call it the Crest, the Cross, because of its straight-wing silhouette against the sky. The legend of the Crest grows. It becomes a phantom that creates a crisis of confidence among the Soviet ground forces. The T-72 tank was supposed to be the king of the battlefield. It was sold to the troops as invulnerable to anything but another tank. Now, officers are whispering about a slow, ugly shadow that creates a sound like tearing linen and leaves radioactive holes in their best armor. The investigation reaches a fever pitch when a spy in the West German logistic chain manages to procure a partial maintenance manual that was allegedly discarded in a trash burn. It is charred and incomplete, but it contains a diagram of the aircraft's fuel system. The Soviet engineers stare at the diagram in silence. "This makes no sense," the Sukhoi engineer says, tracing the lines. "The fuel tanks are inside foam, and they are self-sealing. But look here," he points to the engines. "The intake is placed above the wing." "Why?" the general asks. "To mask the heat signature from the ground," the engineer realizes, "and to use the wing as a shield against debris. And here," the engineer points to a complex web of wires. "This is not a fly-by-wire system, this is cables. Steel cables and pulleys." The room goes silent. Cables? In the age of computers? "It is a backup," the engineer says, his face paling. "They have built a mechanical backup for the hydraulic system. If the hydraulics fail, the pilot can fly the plane, manually, like it is 1945. The general slams his fist on the table. "You are telling me the Americans, the masters of silicon and microchips, have built a plane that flies on pulleys? You are telling me we are spending billions on heat-seeking missiles to shoot down a plane that hides its heat behind its own wings?" The investigation concludes not with an answer, but with a terrified realization of their own vulnerability. They have built a high-tech key, and the Americans have changed the lock to a rusty deadbolt. The Soviets realize they have optimized their entire military to fight a war of speed and electronics. They have radar that can track a Mark III bomber at 60,000 feet. But they have almost nothing that can reliably lock onto a cold, slow piece of titanium flying at treetop level in the rain. They have spent the last decade preparing for Star Wars, and the Americans have just brought a sledgehammer to a chess match. But the question remains, why does it not die? The manual showed the cables, yes, but cables do not stop a missile from blowing the cockpit apart. Cables do not stop the pilot from bleeding out when shrapnel shreds the fuselage. There is one piece of the puzzle missing. The Soviet intelligence analysts suspect there is a central component, a heart to this machine, that they cannot see on the blueprints. Something that protects the most fragile part of the weapon system, the human inside. They scour the stolen documents for references to force fields or composite ceramics. They find nothing. The Americans are hiding the secret of the pilot's survival in plain sight, buried under tons of seemingly useless weight. As the 1980s approach, the Soviet Union decides they must capture one. Or at least, they must see one up close. They need to know what sits inside the nose of that machine, and they need to know what the pilot sits inside. Because until they solve the riddle of the crest, every tank commander from East Berlin to Vladivostok knows that he is driving a steel coffin. While the generals in Moscow were chasing ghosts and theorizing about force fields, a small team of engineers in Farmingdale, New York, was busy building the ugliest airplane in history. The year is 1972. The location is the Fairchild Republic hangars. The atmosphere here is the polar opposite of the sleek, sterilized labs where the F-15 or the F-16 are being born. There are no conversations about Mach speeds or beyond visual range radar. The conversations here are about dirt, mud, and survival. The United States Air Force had a problem. In Vietnam, they had learned a bloody lesson. Their supersonic jets were too fast to see the jungle and too fragile to survive small arms fire. They needed a machine that could do the dirty work. They needed a replacement for the prop-driven Sky Raider. The project was called AX. And the philosophy behind it was radical because it was regressive. The lead designers didn't look at the future, they looked at the past. They studied the German Stuka dive bombers of World War II and the Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik, the famous flying tank. They realized that, to kill a Soviet tank rush in the Fulda Gap, you didn't need a scalpel, you needed a bludgeon. They began with the weapon. In a standard aircraft design process, you build a sleek airframe and then figure out where to bolt on the guns. The AX project did the reverse. They selected a weapon so massive, so violent, that it had never been put on an aircraft before. The GAU-8 Avenger. It is a rotary cannon, the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. It weighs 620 pounds without ammunition. With the full drum of 1,174 rounds, the system weighs as much as a car. It fires 30mm rounds, milk bottles made of depleted uranium, at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The recoil force of the gun is so powerful that it produces 10,000 pounds of thrust in the opposite direction of the flight path. If the pilot fires a long enough burst, the gun actually slows the plane down. The engineers at Fairchild took this monster and simply wrapped an airplane around it. They offset the front landing gear to the side just to make room for the barrel. They mounted the engines high on the fuselage, away from the ground, to prevent them from sucking in rocks and debris from rough, makeshift runways. But the true genius, the secret that was driving the Soviet intelligence officers insane, was the survivability. The designers assumed the plane would get hit. In fact, they planned for it. They abandoned the glass cannon philosophy entirely. They built the A-10 Thunderbolt II with a triple redundancy system. This was the answer to the Soviet mystery of the cables. The plane has two independent hydraulic systems. If a missile severs the first one, the second takes over. If a second missile severs the backup, the pilot flips a switch to manual reversion. In this mode, the high-tech jet becomes a mechanical glider. The stick connects directly to steel cables and pulleys running through the airframe. It takes immense physical strength to fly. The pilot is literally wrestling the wind, but it flies. This was the anomaly the Soviet engineers saw in the stolen diagrams but couldn't believe. The Americans had built a fail-safe that required zero electricity and zero computers. Then, they addressed the engines. The Soviets were right about the placement masking the heat. The twin turbofans are mounted between the tail stabilizers and the wing. From below where the enemy is, the exhaust heat is shielded by the tail. This makes the A-10 a nightmare for heat-seeking missiles like the Strela or the Igla. They simply can't find a lock until the plane has already passed. But the masterpiece of the design was the answer to the Soviet question, how does the pilot survive? They called it the titanium bathtub. The cockpit of the A-10 is not made of aluminum. It is a single seamless tub of titanium armor weighing 1,200 pounds. It ranges from half an inch to 1.5 inches thick. It surrounds the pilot on the bottom and sides. This tub is proofed against direct hits from 23mm high-explosive rounds, the exact ammunition used by the Soviet ZSU Shilkas. When the Soviet colonel in Part 1 saw the plane take fire and keep flying, he wasn't witnessing a miracle. He was witnessing physics. The rounds were impacting the tub and shattering. The pilot, sitting inside this titanium cocoon, feels the thud, hears the hail on the roof, but remains untouched. The canopy is bullet-resistant acrylic, capable of stopping sniper fire. The fuel tanks are filled with reticulated foam, a sponge-like material that prevents the fuel from exploding if ignited. Even if a bullet penetrates the tank, the foam expands, and the self-sealing skin closes the hole. The plane essentially heals itself. By 1975, the first production models were rolling off the line. The Air Force brass hated it. It was slow, top speed of roughly 420 miles per hour, it had no radar, and it was ugly. They jokingly called it the Warthog, but the pilots who flew it knew the truth. They knew they were sitting in the deadliest close support weapon ever devised. While the Soviets were frantically upgrading their radar to catch Mach II fighters, the Americans were deploying a plane that flew so low it could navigate by reading road signs. The source of the mystery was not high-tech wizardry. It was a rejection of high-tech fragility. The Americans had looked at the Soviet tank armies and decided that the only way to stop a tank was to build a tank that could fly, and they were about to introduce it to the world. The stage is set. The Soviets have their theories. The Americans have their monster. The collision of these two realities is inevitable. And when the reveal finally happens, when the Soviets get their undisputed proof of what the Warthog actually is, it won't come from a spy report. It will come from the battlefield, where the theoretical nightmare becomes a horrifying reality. The breakthrough did not come from a battlefield victory. It came from a photocopier in a basement in Virginia. The year is 1981. The Cold War has entered its frostiest phase. In Moscow, the intelligence picture regarding the American Devil is still a mosaic of terrified pilot reports and blurry gun camera footage. The theories about force fields and drone technology still linger in the halls of the Kremlin. But then, the farewell dossier changes everything. While this massive intelligence leak is primarily known for exposing Soviet industrial espionage, the back-and-forth flow of information during this chaotic period inadvertently confirms the specifications of the A-10 for the Soviet High Command. General Shkadov sits in a briefing room that is silent enough to hear a pin drop. A KGB technical officer stands before a projector. He is not smiling. He has the look of a man who is about to deliver a medical diagnosis that is terminal. Comrades, the officer begins, we have been looking for a technological miracle. We have been looking for a complex electronic jamming system or a new composite stealth material. He clicks the projector. A line drawing of the A-10 appears. It is stripped of its skin, revealing the internal skeleton. We were wrong, the officer says. It is not a miracle. It is a brick. He points to the center of the aircraft. We believed the Americans developed a new, compact anti-tank missile. We were wrong. The weapon is a gun. The slide changes to a schematic of the GAU-8 Avenger. Next to it, for scale, is a silhouette of a Soviet Gaz-24 sedan. The gun is larger than the car. A murmur runs through the room. The generals, men who understand ballistics, stare in disbelief. They see the 7 barrels. They see the size of the ammunition drum. 30 millimeters, a tank commander whispers. Depleted uranium. Precisely, the officer replies. They are not shooting explosives at us. They are shooting kinetic penetrators. They are shooting bolts of lightning made of heavy metal. The officer then reveals the most devastating piece of intelligence, the flight profile. The aircraft does not rely on speed. It relies on the assumption that we will hit it. He clicks to the next slide. It shows the titanium bathtub. This, the officer says, tapping the screen, is why our Shilkas failed. We have been firing 23mm high explosive rounds at a tub of titanium armor that is up to 38mm thick. The rounds detonate on the surface. The pilot is inside, untouched. The silence in the room transforms into a palpable anger. The Soviet military has spent billions of rubles developing the ZSU-234 Shilka. It is the pride of their air defense. It is a radar-guided buzzsaw designed to shred thin-skinned jets. And the Americans have effectively neutralized it by simply wrapping the pilot in a metal tub. And the engines? Shkadov asks. The ones that survived the Strela hit? High bypass turbofans, the officer explains. They are separated by the tail structure to mask the infrared signature, but more importantly, the fuel lines. He traces the diagram. The fuel tanks are self-sealing. The lines are redundant. And if all else fails? He pauses, hesitating to say the words that will sound ridiculous in a modern military briefing. The pilot has a crank. He can fly the plane with cables. Like a farm tractor, the realization hits the room like a physical blow. The reveal is not that the Americans are ahead, it is that the Americans have cheated. They have brought a weapon from a different era, upgraded with modern materials, to fight a war that the Soviets thought was about microchips and missiles. The shock turns into a frantic simulation. The Soviet strategists immediately order a wargame. They input the new data, the turn radius of the A-10, which is terrifyingly tight, the armor thickness, and the penetration values of the GAU-8. They run the simulation against a standard Soviet motor rifle regiment, advancing through the Fulda Gap. The results are catastrophic. In the simulation, the Soviet tank columns are decimated. The 8 seconds fly below the radar floor, popping up only for seconds. The Soviet long-range SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, like the SA-6, cannot lock onto them because they are too low. The short-range guns, like the Shilka, bounce off the armor. The shoulder-fired missiles are confused by flares and the masked engine exhaust. The killer statistic of the simulation is the kill ratio. For every one A-10 shot down, the Soviet army loses 12 T-70, 2 tanks and 20 BMP personnel carriers. It is a meat grinder, the analyst reports. The response from the Soviet Union is desperate and expensive. They realize they cannot armor their tanks enough to stop the GAU-8. The depleted uranium rounds sharpen as they penetrate. They burn through the top armor of a T-70, too like a hot needle through wax. So, they try to change the air defense. This reveal drives the frantic development of the 2 K-22 Tunguska. The Soviets realize the Shilka is obsolete against the Warthog. They need something bigger. They rush the development of the Tunguska, a monstrous hybrid system that carries both 30mm cannons and hypersonic missiles. They need the cannons to shred the A-10 sensors and the missiles to catch it before it gets close. They also accelerate the deployment of the Tor missile system, designed specifically to shoot down precision weapons and low-flying aircraft. But the most telling response is the Su-25 Frogfoot. The Soviets, having seen the genius of the A-10, attempt to copy it. They build their own flying tank. The Su-25 is a formidable machine, rugged and powerful. But the Soviet engineers cannot replicate the GAU-8. They cannot build a gun that big and make it fly. The Su-25 carries a standard 30mm cannon with a fraction of the ammunition and a fraction of the power. They have built a look-alike, but they haven't captured the soul of the machine. By 1985, the American Devil has become the primary bogeyman of the Warsaw Pact. Every Soviet tanker is drilled on the silhouette. Straight wings, two tails, engines high. If you see the cross, the instructors tell the terrified recruits, "Do not rely on your armor. Dive into a ditch. The tank is a trap." The mystery is solved. The Soviets know exactly what it is. It is a slow, ugly, titanium-armored brute that breaks all the rules of modern warfare. And knowing this terrifies them more than the mystery ever did, because now they know that their entire armored doctrine, the iron fist of the Soviet Union, has a glass jaw, and they are powerless to fix it before the Cold War ends. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the feared invasion of the Fulda Gap never materialized. For a brief moment, it seemed that the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a weapon born solely to kill Soviet armor in Germany, was a relic without a cause. The United States Air Force, obsessed with the sleek lines of the future, tried to bury it. They wanted to replace the ugly, slow Warthog with fast, multi-role fighters like the F-16. But history has a way of testing weapons, regardless of what the generals want. In January of 1991, the theoretical nightmare that had terrified Colonel Petrov and General Shkadov finally became reality. It did not happen in the green valleys of Europe, but on the flat, unforgiving sands of Iraq and Kuwait. The Iraqi army was the perfect proxy for the Soviet military. They were armed with T-72 tanks, BMP personnel carriers, and ZSU-234 Shilka anti-aircraft guns. They used Soviet doctrine. They had dug into defensive berms, creating the kill zones the Soviets had always bragged about. The 8 seconds were deployed, and the result was a massacre so one-sided that it permanently altered the history of aerial warfare. The killer statistic that emerged from Operation Desert Storm is staggering. The A-10 fleet, comprising only a fraction of the coalition air power, was responsible for destroying more than 900 tanks, 2,000 military vehicles, and 1,200 artillery pieces. But the statistic that truly vindicated the titanium bathtub design was the survival rate. During the conflict, 8 seconds were hit. They were hit often. They flew into the teeth of the exact air defenses the Soviets had spent decades perfecting. One A-10 took a direct hit from a shoulder-fired missile that blew off the entire right elevator and shredded the tail cone. In any other jet, an F-16, an F-18, a MiG-29, the pilot would be dead. The aircraft would have tumbled out of the sky. The A-10 pilot simply felt the thud, checked his instruments, and realized the hydraulics were gone. He disengaged the flight computer, grabbed the stick with both hands, and flew the plane manually using the steel cables. He landed safely at his base. The ground crew stared at the aircraft in silence. It was missing a third of its control surfaces. It looked like a carcass, but it had brought its pilot home. This was the moment the Soviet military philosophy truly died. They saw their best tanks, the T-72 tanks they had exported to the world as invincible juggernauts, turned into burning scrap metal by a plane that cost a fraction of the price of a sophisticated fighter. The A-10 proved that the high-tech obsession of the late Cold War was flawed. The Soviets had bankrupted their economy, building complex, fragile systems like the Tunguska to counter a threat that couldn't be jammed or tricked. You cannot jam a bullet. You cannot spoof a pilot looking out the window with binoculars. The macro theme of this victory is the triumph of pragmatism over prestige. The Soviet Union collapsed in part because it could not sustain the cost of the arms race. They were obsessed with parity. If the Americans built a bomber, they had to build a bigger bomber. If the Americans built a stealth fighter, they had to build a counter-radar. But the A-10 broke the cycle. It was a cheap solution that forced the Soviets to spend billions on expensive responses. It was an asymmetric economic weapon. While the Kremlin poured rubles into the bottomless pit of high-tech air defense, the Americans were mass-producing a flying gun that required minimal maintenance and could operate from dirt roads. The legacy of the A-10 is unique in military history. It is the only aircraft that the Air Force has tried to retire 4 separate times, only to be forced by Congress and the Army to keep it flying. Why? Because the soldiers on the ground demand it. When a squad of infantry is pinned down by enemy fire, they don't want a high-altitude bomber dropping a GPS-guided bomb from 30,000 feet. They want the Warthog. They want to see the ugly silhouette banking under the cloud layer. They want to hear that sound. Bruh. That sound has become the psychological anthem of American air superiority. It is a sound that signals safety to the friendly forces and absolute, inescapable death to the enemy. Even today, in the 2020s, as we discuss fifth-generation stealth fighters and drone swarms, the A-10 is still flying. It has been upgraded with digital displays and new wings, but the soul of the machine remains the same. It is still a titanium bathtub wrapped around a cannon. It outlived the Soviet Union. It outlived the Warsaw Pact. It outlived the T-72 tanks it was built to destroy. The mystery that began on that rainy day in East Germany, the impossible plane that refused to die, became the defining reality of the modern battlefield. The Soviets were right to be terrified. They looked up and saw something that didn't belong in the jet age. They saw a monster that didn't care about aerodynamics or speed. They saw the end of their era, flying at 300 knots, coming straight for them. And in the end, the simple truth prevailed. You don't need to be faster than the bullet if you are tougher than the gun.